In the 4th year of my marriage to Carlos Grealish, he personally sent me to prison. Before I was imprisoned, he told me, "If you do something wrong, you must accept the punishment. I hope after this, you'll learn to behave." Later, I was disfigured and crippled, and I truly became as obedient as he wished. But then he started begging me with red eyes, "Can you love me like you used to?" Ding! This novel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. The day I was released, there was a heavy snowfall outside. The prison guard who escorted me out was a young woman in her 20s. After a series of procedures, the prison gates finally opened. "Is your family here to pick you up?" I pressed my lips together and didn't speak. She didn't mind. Instead, she patted my shoulder gently and said softly, "Your husband came to see you many times during these 3 years. It was clear that he cared about you." The prison guard didn't know that it was my husband, Carlos Grealish, who had sent me to prison. That's why she used the word care. But it made sense. He did care about me. He cared about when I would die. 3 years ago, I stabbed Georgia. She was the first love that Carlos cherished in his heart. If he hadn't arrived in time, I might have stabbed her a second, third time, until she was dead. I still remember how Carlos looked, pale as a sheet, holding Georgia in his arms. He covered Georgia's wound, his voice more anxious than ever. "Georgia, you'll be okay. The doctor will be here soon." Georgia looked like a fish out of water, and when she looked at me, her whole body suddenly stiffened. "Carlos. I'm so scared." Carlos followed her gaze and saw me standing not far away. "Amelia Wharton, I won't let you get away with this." Hearing this, I was unusually calm and even freed up a hand to wipe the blood off my face. As expected, Carlos would never side with me. I hurt Georgia, so he had to make me pay. The setting sun mixed with blood, sinking into the horizon. Then a long siren sounded in my ears. I was sentenced to 3 years. The judge asked me why I stabbed someone. I only said, "She killed Milo." No one knew who Milo was. Except Carlos. He jumped up. "Amelia, are you crazy? You wanted to kill someone over a dog?" From beginning to end, Carlos thought I was unreasonable. I looked at his furious face and felt nothing but irony. He didn't understand what Milo meant to me. He wasn't just an ordinary dog. He was my family. 4 years ago, I picked him up from a garbage pile. I bathed him, fed him, and took him to the vet. During those lonely days, he was the one who kept me company. In this world, only he loved me. Only him. I could never forget how Milo looked that day. So small and thin, lying motionless in my arms. I mocked myself with a bitter smile. "Carlos, you know nothing." Carlos's expression froze, but he quickly regained his composure. "Amelia, it's just a dog, you're too willful. If you do something wrong, you must accept the punishment. I hope after this, you'll learn to behave." In the first few nights after I entered prison, I often dreamt of Georgia's horrifying face. Dreamt of her telling me about Milo's death in my ear. That dog, like you, was so despicable. Clearly had no ability, yet always pretended to be fierce, so disobedient. I had no choice but to hang it up and scald it with boiling water again and again until it couldn't even scream, then I let it down. Who knew it couldn't handle it, just twitched a few times and died. Truly, I'm sorry, Miss Amelia. I didn't understand. Milo was so good. He never bit anyone. Everyone liked him. If you had a grudge, come at me, couldn't you? Why did you have to kill Milo? During those days, hatred filled my entire being. I started to regret. Regret why I didn't just slit her throat or stab her heart with the knife, so she would definitely die. But slowly, I didn't have time to think about those things. Because I was beaten every day, and there wasn't a good spot left on my body. I was very busy every day. Busy trying to please the prison boss. Busy figuring out how to get beaten less. This kind of life lasted a long time. I don't remember when they stopped beating me. Maybe they got bored, or maybe for some other reason. I don't know. I only remembered that the night they didn't steal my blanket, I almost cried from happiness. At that moment, I suddenly realized I hadn't thought about the past for a long time. Amelia, when you leave, walk straight ahead and don't look back. This was the last thing the prison guard said to me. After saying goodbye to her, I dragged my injured leg and slowly walked out the door. I didn't tell Carlos that I was being released today. Because I was scared. Not just because of the beatings. In my second year in prison, there was a fire. I was both unlucky and lucky. Unlucky because I was trapped in the fire, disfigured, and left with a limp. Lucky because the firefighters didn't give up on me and risked their lives to save me. Being trapped in the fire wasn't an accident. At that time, I clearly felt someone push me, causing me to fall and get pinned under heavy debris. It's hard not to overthink this. I hurt Georgia, and maybe he didn't want to let me off so easily. To stay alive, I had to stay far away from Carlos. After all, he never loved me. He married me only for the sake of benefits. On our wedding night, when he possessed my body, the unexpected name Georgia that escaped his lips explained everything. The moonlight that night shone through the window onto the torn wedding dress, leaving a silver-white trail on the floor, shattering along with the dreams of my youth. I don't want to have any more entanglements with Carlos. So I definitely cannot return to the Grealish family. I boarded the bus at the prison gate, idly watching the scenery outside the window. It wasn't until the driver reminded me that we had reached the final stop that I came back to my senses. This place was far from the city center, and the living standards were generally low. The noisy market had a faint, smoky atmosphere. It seemed that making a living here didn't require background, education, or family status. It felt like as long as you were willing to work hard, you could survive. I suddenly thought this place might be a good refuge. There was a breakfast shop at the market entrance looking for long-term workers. Work started at 3 a.m. and ended at 11 a.m. $1,000 a month. I went to apply with great joy, but when the boss saw the burn scars on my face, she hesitated. I quickly took out a mask from my pocket and put it on. I will cover it, I won't scare the customers. The shop must have been short on staff because, despite my limp, the boss hired me. Then I went to rent a room. It was only 20 square meters, but the rent was cheap. However, just as I was about to leave, I overheard a conversation between other tenants and the landlord. Did you see the news today? The CEO of the Grealish Group issued a missing person notice to find his wife who was just released from prison. The landlord covered her mouth in disbelief. What? The tenant continued, this CEO is really handsome and affectionate, but why did his wife go to jail? Instinctively, I tightened the mask on my face. I didn't dare to listen to the rest of the conversation and closed the door. At night, I lay on the creaky wooden bed, tossing and turning. I couldn't understand the current Carlos. I had already been to prison. Why wouldn't he let me go? I started unconsciously picking at my fingers, my thoughts drifting back to the past. Carlos and I had known each other since we were little. I liked him. I liked him for a long, long time. The adults often said we were childhood sweethearts and that I would marry Carlos in the future. The Grealish and Wharton families had always been business partners. A marriage between wealthy families was nothing unusual. Both our parents tacitly agreed to our marriage. But I genuinely liked him. I liked the serious way he listened to me. I liked his dimples when he smiled. I liked the sight of him when he skipped class with me. I liked the rebellious look in his eyes when he fought for me. I thought he liked me too. Until Georgia appeared. She was the only poor student in our class. She wore a high ponytail and a white dress that had been washed until it turned yellow. She was diligent, beautiful, and kind-hearted. Everyone liked her. Including Carlos. That was the first time I saw love in Carlos's eyes. He would race cars for Georgia. He would make chocolates for Georgia himself. I was no longer by his side. Only Georgia was. But I didn't like her. Because I had seen her fawning and acting coy with the thugs at the school gate. It was completely opposite to her usual aloof and solitary demeanor. When I told Carlos about this, he rarely showed me a cold face. Amelia Wharton, I always thought you were willful but a good girl. I didn't expect you to be like those people, doubting Georgia. Amelia Wharton. He never called my full name before. I feel like Carlos is drifting further and further away from me. I'm not the kind of person who clings to others desperately. Carlos likes Georgia, and I can accept that. So, after the college entrance exams, I applied to a university in another city. I started to adapt to a life without Carlos, putting all my energy into my studies. Those days were calm and fulfilling. At that time, I thought it wouldn't be so bad to live a plain and simple life forever. But fate always loves to play tricks on people. In my sophomore year, my parents died in a car accident. For the first time, I realized that when a person is extremely heartbroken, they don't shed tears. Dry heaving, loss of voice, ringing in the ears, limbs cold as ice. I watched the people who came to mourn as if I were a puppet on strings. They probably all pitied me or felt sorry for me. I couldn't tell who was genuine and who was not. Just as I was about to collapse from exhaustion, I was suddenly pulled into someone's arms. It was Carlos. I hadn't seen him in a long time. His eyes were red, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Amelia, don't be afraid, I'm here." Since my parents' accident, he was the first person to worry that I might be scared. For a moment, it felt like we were back in our teenage years. Back to the days without Georgia. Back then, he was very good to me. In a daze, he still seemed like the Carlos who fought for me and took me out of class. "Carlos, from now on, I'll be all alone." I leaned into his arms, tears streaming down my face. After my parents passed away, I had to learn to take over the Wharton company. The board members were all tough nuts to crack and didn't respect my leadership at all. They thought I was completely incompetent. And in fact, they were right. I hadn't graduated from college, nor had I interned at the company. Many times, I was just an outsider. But I couldn't hand the Wharton company over to these people. Each of them was just looking to make money, even forcing me to sell the brand my parents had built over the years. Doing so would undoubtedly destroy my parents' hard work. In my desperate situation, Carlos's father came to me. He told me that as long as the Grealish and Wharton families united through marriage, those people wouldn't dare make any moves. Mr. Grealish was a businessman who never did a deal that would lose money. A marriage alliance could help me out of my predicament, and it could also elevate the Grealish group. But doing so wouldn't be fair to Carlos. The person he liked was Georgia. Perhaps seeing my hesitation, Mr. Grealish added, "That girl named Georgia has already gone abroad." The marriage alliance is something Carlos agreed to. "You both are grown-ups now, you should know what needs to be done and what shouldn't." Mr. Grealish's meaning was clear. People like us shouldn't talk about love, everything should be for the benefit of the family. And so, Carlos and I got married. In this marriage filled with entangled interests, we each got what we needed. How much of the love from our youth remained, I didn't know. Perhaps when my parents died, he truly felt sorry for me. But when Georgia left, he probably still resented me. But life has to go on, and both Carlos and I understood that. That's why, on a certain confusing and emotional night, he held me and said, "Amelia, let's live well from now on." I think he had also resigned himself to fate. I started to try hard to be a qualified wife. Carlos was very afraid of the dark, so the house was always brightly lit at night when he slept. There were no streetlights on the small path from the garage to the house, so I would go there every night to pick him up. Then I would hold his hand, and we would walk home together. Milo was found in the flower bushes along that small path. It was dirty all over, its obsidian eyes staring at me unblinkingly. I held it in my arms, soothing its emotions. It was very obedient, occasionally rubbing its head against my clothes. I ignored the impatience that flashed in Carlos's eyes and brought Milo home. Milo, like me, was a child without parents. It was my failure to protect it that led to it being lost. I didn't know Georgia would return to the country after 4 years. And ever since she came back, Carlos rarely came home. I waited at the door every day, but he never showed up, not even a single text message. When he did come back occasionally, there was always an unfamiliar perfume scent on him. I didn't know whose it was, but it definitely wasn't his. One night, he texted me, saying he was drunk and asked me to pick him up. When I pushed open the door of the private room, I saw him pinning Georgia against the wall, kissing her passionately. Carlos had lost control, they were kissing as if they couldn't bear to part. I heard him complain bitterly. "Why couldn't it be you who married me? I numbly closed the door, as if I had never been there. At that moment, I suddenly realized clearly that I no longer loved Carlos. Carlos never mentioned divorce to me. Even though Georgia had returned, even though Georgia had confessed her love to him, he wouldn't mention divorce. He continued, as always, to maintain this suffocating marriage with difficulty. Even when Georgia embarrassed herself at the charity gala, he wouldn't speak up for her. Because he was Carlos Grealish. But I didn't expect Georgia to go so far as to hurt Milo. She deliberately provoked me, with the aim of making me lash out, so I would end up in jail. She was very smart. She knew the Grealish family wouldn't want a woman who had been to jail. I thought I could get a good night's sleep after getting out of prison. But I still had insomnia. At 2:30 in the morning, after washing up, I went to work at the breakfast shop. The boss disliked the way I walked and only let me wash dishes in the back kitchen. Fortunately, I worked diligently and never complained, so the boss was somewhat satisfied with me. Except for the part about asking permission to use the restroom. She was annoyed. If you want to go to the restroom, just go. Don't ask for permission, the customers will laugh at you. I nodded awkwardly. Next time, I still couldn't help it. It was a habit I picked up in prison, asking permission to use the restroom. It's hard to change in a short time. I took on all the dirty and tiring work in the shop because I wanted to keep myself busy. Because once I stopped, I would start daydreaming, picking at my fingers until they bled. It really didn't seem like the behavior of a normal person. No one would have thought that the once glamorous Miss Wharton would now be a poor dishwasher. But this seemed to be my fate. I ran into Carlos again half a month later. I should have realized that with his career thriving, finding someone would be a piece of cake for him. That afternoon after work, a black private car followed me. If I walked faster, it sped up. If I slowed down, it slowed down. When I suddenly stopped, it quickly braked, blocking my way. Finally, the car door opened, and out stepped a tall man in a black suit. Those familiar almond-shaped eyes made my hands and feet feel cold. I didn't look at him again and continued walking forward. But just as we were about to pass by each other, he suddenly grabbed my wrist tightly. I struggled, but the difference in strength between men and women was too great. When he trembled as he tried to touch the scar on my face, I turned my head to avoid him. After a long time, his eyes reddened, and his voice choked. "Amelia, come home with me, okay?" I couldn't hold back the disgust in my heart and looked at him mockingly. Carlos's raised hand froze in midair, looking somewhat at a loss. "Amelia, why didn't you tell me you were out of prison?" Hearing him say this so seriously, I almost vomited. "Tell you, and then wait for you to continue to take revenge on me?" I didn't say anything, just quietly listened to his narration. "Amelia, I know you resent me, but you made a mistake and broke the law, so you had to be punished. This matter is over now. From now on, let's start over. Come back with me, I'll take good care of you." I lowered my head, not looking at him anymore. This confrontation ended with my indifference. The cold winter wind pierced to the bone. In the end, Carlos compromised and let go of my hand. "Amelia, I'll come to see you again tomorrow." Carlos didn't leave. At 1 in the morning, I saw his car parked downstairs. On a winter night, there was no moon. The howling wind outside the window sounded like a mournful wail, making my heart tremble. I couldn't help but feel a chill rising from the bottom of my heart. The alarm clock rang again, another sleepless night. The next day, I went to work at the breakfast shop as usual. Carlos followed behind me. I still didn't speak to him. His tentative inquiries and concerns were all ignored by me. I treated him like air, leaving him to one side. I thought this would make him leave. But I was wrong. Carlos now clung to me like a stubborn plaster, impossible to shake off. I didn't want to admit it, but I was indeed affected by his presence. I spoke less and daydreamed more. One morning while washing dishes, I lost focus. Unconsciously, I picked at my fingers, and crimson blood stained the dishes. The boss immediately started yelling. "Usually it's fine if you ask for permission to go to the bathroom, but today you got your blood on my dishes. Ugly and incompetent, it's really disgusting." Just when I thought I would be kicked out of the restaurant the next second, a figure stood in front of me. Who do you think you are to speak to Amelia like that? A hint of coldness flashed in Carlos's eyes, a sign that he was about to get angry. The boss lady wanted to say more, but when she noticed the luxury car parked outside, her attitude changed immediately. She pulled my hand and pretended to care. Amelia, that's not what I meant. I was just anxious. Your hand is injured, go home and rest. Don't worry about the shop. Expressionless, I pulled my hand away from the boss lady and limped out of the breakfast shop. I knew I couldn't keep this job. Carlos followed me out. No, to be precise, it wasn't a chase. Because of my limited mobility, he just took a few quick steps to easily block my path. I thought he was being unreasonable. He loved Georgia. But now, he was entangled with me. Amelia, don't work there anymore. I'll take you to see a doctor, to heal your leg. If it can't be done here, we'll go abroad. And your face, it can be treated too. Even if it can't be fixed, it doesn't matter. No matter what you become, I'll stay with you. Amelia, we haven't divorced yet. You're still my wife. Carlos grabbed my wrist, endlessly saying things I didn't want to hear. I shook him off abruptly and took a few hurried steps back. I looked at the place he had touched with disgust. Carlos closed his eyes helplessly. After a while, as if making a difficult decision, he said, Amelia, the Wharton family's old house is in my hands. As long as you agree to come back with me, I'll return it to you. I was stunned. The old house he mentioned was the home I had lived in for 20 years. 3 years ago, because of my imprisonment, the Wharton family's stock plummeted and the company faced bankruptcy. People deserted us, and even the rich kids who usually hung out with me shut their doors. Even the Grealish family stood by and watched. Helpless, I agreed to sell the old house to pay the employees' final wages. The buyer, a friend of my father's, promised not to resell or renovate it. He said I could buy it back any time I had the money. I once fantasized about working hard, rebuilding the Wharton family, and reclaiming the old house. But it all seemed like a pipe dream. I had been to prison, no company would hire me. After my release, I inquired about it. I found out the buyer had resold the house and he went abroad. I didn't expect it to be Carlos. You see, I thought I would be free after being released from prison. That I wouldn't have to live those humiliating days anymore. But evidently, I was wrong. I still couldn't live as I wished. Carlos Grealish. This was the first thing I said to him after my release. He looked like a child who had just received candy, his eyes lit up. But in the next second, my words extinguished all his hopes. Can't you just let me go? I didn't look at his reaction. At some point, Carlos pulled me into his arms. He held me tightly, afraid that if he loosened his grip, I would escape. Amelia, I can't help it. I really can't live without you. For these 3 years, you refused to see me. I was almost driven crazy. I know you hate me. I'll spend my whole life making it up to you, believe me, okay? Carlos said a lot. But I didn't listen to a single word. I numbly got into his car. The gradually familiar roads outside the window made me feel a little dazed. Oh God, I haven't done anything wrong, so why are you torturing me like this? Carlos brought me back to the Flower Creek Villa. It was the place we had lived for 3 years. As soon as I got out of the car, I saw Georgia. She was wearing an expensive Valentino outfit, unabashedly sizing me up and down. When she saw the scar on my face, the contempt in her eyes was unmistakable. She walked up and linked arms with Carlos, smiling as she said, Carlos, I finally get to see you. Carlos didn't say anything, stepping back a few steps to put some distance between himself and Georgia. Georgia's expression turned somewhat unpleasant. Carlos, why did you bring her here? She once tried to kill me. Seeing her makes me scared. Can you make her leave, please? Carlos frowned slightly, looking a bit displeased. Let's not bring up the past. Amelia is my wife. She always will be. To be fair, if it were the past, hearing Carlos say this would have made me so happy I wouldn't know what to do with myself. But now, I just felt a churning in my stomach, like I was going to throw up. Georgia obviously couldn't take this blow, her previously arrogant demeanor completely vanished. Her eyes glistened with tears that seemed on the verge of falling, making her look very pitiable. What about me? Carlos, didn't you say before that you married Amelia out of necessity? Didn't you say she was like a sister to you? Carlos pondered for a moment, as if recalling the past, his expression regretful. Georgia, in the past, I couldn't see my own heart clearly. The person I've truly loved has always been Amelia. We grew up together and lived together for many years. She had long since entered my heart. These past 3 years without her have been very painful, a different kind of pain from when you left me. This pain is heart-wrenching. I regret sending her to prison. Carlos's heartfelt confession left me surprisingly calm. For a moment, I even thought he was childish and wanted to give him a lesson in legal knowledge. I wanted to tell him that I went to prison because I broke the law. Whether he regrets it or not, it has no bearing on anything. The procedures for transferring the old house were somewhat troublesome. Carlos said he would handle it and asked me to wait a few days. He also said Georgia wouldn't appear at Flower Creek Villa, so I could stay without worry. I never believed what he said. Because at this moment, Georgia was already in front of me. Amelia, you're in such a state, why are you still clinging to Carlos? Georgia had put away her tears, now looking high and mighty. Are you sick? I couldn't hold back and mocked her. You think that just because you treat Carlos like a treasure, the whole world should too? I sincerely wish you and that scumbag to be locked together forever. Georgia's eyes widened in anger, unable to hide her fury. Amelia, why do you have to speak so harshly? I shook my head helplessly. Georgia, I only cursed at you a couple of times, and you can't take it? Rest assured, all I can do is curse you here. I only hate myself for not having the ability to make you pay. Seeing her frustrated face, I wanted to laugh out loud. But I couldn't laugh. I was afraid that if I started laughing, I wouldn't be able to stop and would end up crying. That would be too embarrassing. I chased Georgia out. Before leaving, she still threatened me. Amelia, don't get complacent. I will make you pay. Georgia said she would make me pay. I just didn't expect the price to come so quickly. When I rushed to the old house, it was already mostly engulfed in flames. Thick smoke billowed into the sky, the air filled with a suffocating acrid smell. Tears fell and mixed with the dirt. I saw Georgia emerge from the corner. Amelia, this is the consequence of opposing me. Whether it's that dog or this house, I won't let them go. She seemed to have gone mad. Obviously, she had worked hard for years and finally reached this point, but with this one act, she lost everything. However, I felt like I was going to be driven mad by her too. The impulse to kill her surged again. I sprang up and grabbed her neck, almost choking her to death. She was terrified, using all her strength to push me away, gasping for breath while clutching her neck. She stumbled, crawling away. I was knocked to the ground, hitting my forehead on a stone, blood gushing out. But I felt no pain, grabbing a stone on the ground and hurling it at her. Just when I thought I would hit her, Carlos suddenly appeared, shielding her. To protect Georgia, he didn't even care about his own life. Amelia, you're bleeding. I'll take you to the hospital. Carlos was badly hit by me, coughing several times, his face flushed. Tears blurred my vision, obscuring everything in front of me. I lifted my foot, almost rushing into the flames. It's gone. I've lost everything. Dad, Mom, what should I do? I couldn't stop myself from collapsing to the ground, losing consciousness. When I woke up again, I was in the hospital. Carlos, he let Georgia go. He said he owed Georgia a life, and he had no choice. Amelia, back then, I got into trouble and was cornered in an alley by a gang. It was Georgia who saved me. She was assaulted by those people and developed severe depression. It was very difficult for her to survive. This is what I owe her. I turned to my side, looking at the pained expression on the person in front of me, and mocked. What you owe her, should I be the one to repay it? Carlos' eyes were bloodshot, and he hurriedly explained to me. Amelia, Georgia, and I are even now. It's over between us. From now on, it will be just the two of us. I beg you, love me like before, okay? Even? Over? Wishful thinking. The game has just begun. I gently held Carlos' hand and softly said, okay. After being discharged from the hospital, I told Carlos that I wanted to find a job. Without a second thought, he brought me into his company. Naturally, I was more than willing. Because Carlos is indeed an excellent teacher, and following him, I could learn a lot. I always put on a look of admiration when he taught me. Just like when I was infatuated with him in my youth. He enjoyed it very much. He would tirelessly explain a single point to me several times, watching me go from confused to understanding. He said he enjoyed this sense of accomplishment. This also made me realize that when the Wharton family went bankrupt, besides the impact of my imprisonment, a significant reason was mismanagement. I began to madly absorb knowledge. As for whether the other people in the company looked at me differently, it didn't matter. Let them be, it wouldn't hurt me anyway. I grew quickly. Carlos would take me with him on every business trip, to different countries, meeting different people. Gradually, I transformed from someone out of touch with society into a project manager of a listed company. This rapid growth caught the attention of Carlos' father. In fact, I hadn't seen him since I got out of prison. Carlos said his father had retired. In my opinion, that wasn't true. His father still held the real power in the company. Otherwise, he wouldn't have found me so quickly. 3 years ago when I got into trouble, he quickly issued a statement to distance himself from me. He declared that the Grealish family would never harbor a criminal and promised compensation to Georgia. It was nothing more than a precaution to avoid the Wharton family's troubles affecting the Grealish family. He was cautious and meticulous, finally achieving what he wanted. Now the Grealish group had become a leader in the industry. He wanted me to leave the Grealish group. Amelia, your presence will affect Carlos. I told Carlos about this. At night, I held his hand, walking along the path back to the Flower Creek villa. Carlos was afraid of the dark. Every time we passed the unlit section of the road, he would unconsciously hold my hand tighter. But this time, I let go of his hand. He keenly noticed this change. Amelia, what's wrong? I looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. He cared a lot about my emotions and immediately became a little nervous. Amelia, don't cry. Tell me, what's wrong? I exaggeratedly told him about his father wanting me to leave. Carlos, will you drive me away? He pulled me into his arms, his large hand stroking my back, his voice firm. No, no one can drive you away. Carlos defied his father's wishes. Not only did he keep me, but he also said he wanted to hold another wedding. They had a big fight over this. How much does he love me? Not necessarily. He just re-experienced the joy of rebellion. His obsession with Georgia back then was mainly because his life under his father's control was too oppressive. Georgia's appearance was like a spice, allowing him to rebel a little against his father. This rebellion was as addictive to him as opium. Carlos didn't love Georgia, it was just that ridiculous life-saving grace that made him mistake it for love. Rebelling for love, he thought it was noble. But people are happiest when they are closest to happiness. When he was with Georgia, that feeling ceased to exist. Once the pure love is dragged into the mundane world, it loses its luster. Carlos and I grew up together, and all the feelings were real. He's not stupid, he can naturally feel my burning and passionate love. But during those 3 years in prison, that love disappeared. The things that originally belonged to him were gone, and he would think and miss them. My goodness, in his memory, kept deepening. What I needed to do was to leave an imprint of this feeling in his heart. I started to bring up the past with him. Carlos is afraid of the dark because when he was a child, he was locked in a basement for 2 days and 2 nights by his father's mistress. At that time, no one cared whether he lived or died, except me. I found out he was missing, so I followed that woman. I told him, actually, I was also afraid at that time, afraid that crazy woman would harm me, but as long as I thought of you, I wasn't afraid of anything. Carlos seemed genuinely moved, kissing my forehead with deep affection. Amelia, I love you. In this world, only you are the best to me. I closed my eyes, hiding my emotions, pretending to look happy. I suddenly remembered how passionately he once treated Georgia. Now, it was reversed. Georgia might never understand why Carlos suddenly stopped loving her. This man is despicable. Always longing for what he can't have. Carlos took this wedding very seriously. He changed the venue several times. I specifically chose a day when he was busiest to meet someone. Nick. He was the thug who had beaten Carlos. And also Georgia's ex-boyfriend. Ever since Carlos mentioned that Georgia had saved him, I had my doubts. I knew Georgia mingled well with those thugs at the school gate. You become like those you are close to. To say she was a brave person who stood up for justice, I wouldn't believe it even if you beat me to death. Sure enough, with a bit of effort, I figured out the whole story. Georgia and Nick were just putting on a show, aiming to get some benefits from Carlos. Georgia threatened to kill herself, begging Carlos not to make it public. The matter was brushed over ambiguously. Later, Georgia took the money given by Carlos's father and went abroad with Nick. But it didn't take long for Nick's true nature to be fully exposed. He not only squandered the money but also physically abused Georgia. Unable to bear it, Georgia abandoned Nick and secretly returned home. What Georgia didn't expect was that even after getting married, Carlos still missed her. She began to regret it, even wanting to marry Carlos. But this was understandable. The man in front of me was ugly and vulgar. Speaking of Georgia, his facial expression was extremely ferocious. That bitch Georgia dared to be clever and abandon me, now she has to obediently serve me at home. Such a woman deserves a beating, always dreaming of becoming a princess. Georgia was also unlucky. After being forcibly sent back to her hometown by Carlos, she ran into Nick. I heard Nick treated her like a servant, beating and scolding her constantly. I can imagine Georgia must have been full of hatred. I begged Nick not to let Georgia come to disrupt my wedding with Carlos. Carlos still sometimes thinks of Georgia and says he wants to give her some money as compensation. I'm very worried, so I beg you to keep an eye on her. I looked like a humble woman afraid of losing her husband. Nick's expression was somewhat disdainful. But upon hearing the word money, his attitude immediately changed, and he agreed repeatedly. However, the greed in his eyes betrayed him. On the wedding day, Carlos invited almost all the prominent figures in the city. I wore a white wedding dress, looking at the beautiful face in the mirror, feeling a bit dazed. Carlos took me to see a doctor. Although it was painful, the results were good. By today, my face no longer showed any signs of injury. Carlos hugged me from behind, resting his head on my neck. Amelia, I'm so happy, how about you? I also nodded with a smile, pretending to be shy. This wasn't a lie. I did feel very happy. Especially the moment I saw Georgia after the wedding started. She must have suffered a lot, her face pale, so thin she was just skin and bones. I knew Nick wouldn't easily let Georgia out. So, I had to let Nick know that Georgia still had value, still had the potential to generate money. With Nick's personality, he would definitely seize this opportunity. I was very satisfied with the current result. That crazy woman Georgia did not disappoint, charging at me with a fruit knife. Unfortunately, I had prepared in advance. Just as she was about to reach me, I quickly hid behind Carlos. Carlos surprised me. Even though he had already been stabbed, he still protected me tightly in his arms. By the time everyone reacted, Carlos was almost unconscious. Carlos! I must have given my best performance here. Tears flowed continuously from beginning to end. Georgia was taken away by the police. With Mr. Grealish's temperament, he wouldn't easily let this woman off. Of course, I no longer needed to worry about these things. After all, my dear husband is still in the hospital. Carlos's condition is very poor. Due to the deep wound, he couldn't move while lying in bed. I really didn't want to take care of him, so I pretended to be heartbroken and fainted from crying. When Carlos found out, he regretted making me worry. However, I couldn't avoid seeing him forever. I had to go when necessary. After I heard that George's matter was completely resolved, I went to see Carlos. He was very surprised to see me and coughed several times from excitement. Just as I was about to sit down, his expression changed. Amelia, get out. This sudden change left me a bit stunned. Just when I thought he was in a bad mood, a strange smell filled the air. I squatted down to check and found out that Carlos had wet himself. He turned his head away in shame, unable to look at me. I didn't mind, just held his wrist and softly said, "Carlos, don't worry. No matter what happens to you, I'll always be with you." These words weren't meant for Carlos, but for his father outside the door. I needed to show my sincerity so he would let me stay in the company without worries. Carlos's father is getting old, and he will have to retire eventually. There is no one else to inherit the company but Carlos. But now that Carlos is incapacitated, he needs someone who can truly care for him. Obviously, I met his requirements. During Carlos's illness, I took over all his work. I completed several major projects very successfully. Not only that, but I also reformed the company and introduced new technologies. Initially, the board was dissatisfied, but after making money and sharing the benefits, those voices disappeared. Gradually, everyone adapted to my management style. A year later, when Carlos returned to the company, everything had changed. His old ways were no longer suitable. The most important thing was his emotions. Due to the many humiliating moments during his illness, his emotions were very unstable. Any project he handled ended disastrously. This sense of defeat left him feeling powerless. However, I comforted him. I said, "Carlos, none of this matters. The key is for you to recover." This seemingly indifferent remark significantly improved his mood. Carlos's failures gave me a good reason to drive him out of the company. After that, our roles seemed to have reversed. I became the one going to work and earning money, while he became the one waiting silently at home. At first, I was willing to humor him with a few comforting words. But later, the company became so busy that I didn't have the energy to deal with him anymore. So, when he once again suggested we watch a movie together, I directly showed my displeasure. "Carlos, the company is so busy, and all you think about is this? Can you be more sensible?" He was angry but didn't dare to show it in front of me. He was suppressing his feelings. But such incidents happened more than once. I stopped controlling my temper towards Carlos, and he became increasingly cautious around me. One day, I saw a bottle of sedatives in the bedside drawer. Only then did I realize that Carlos even had trouble sleeping. I pretended not to see it and quietly put the medicine back. A new intern joined the company, looking very much like a young Carlos. On his third day at work, he confessed to me on message, saying he liked me. I've seen many people trying to climb up, but it was the first time I encountered someone like him. Knowing full well that I had a husband, he still dared to be so blatant. I didn't respond to him, because I wanted him to understand the cost of trying to climb up. I rarely called Carlos on my own initiative. He was very excited to hear my voice. I told him to come to the company for lunch. He was so surprised by my invitation that he took a while to react. Okay. I'll come to find you soon." Unfortunately, that lunch didn't happen. Because when Carlos arrived, he saw the intern with his arm around my shoulder. I had never seen Carlos so angry. He completely forgot his upbringing. He grabbed the intern by the collar and punched him repeatedly. When the intern was barely conscious, I finally picked up the phone and called the police. Carlos was not taken away by the police. Because he was diagnosed with a mental illness, he was confined to a mental hospital. I originally didn't want to see him again. But there was still one important thing I hadn't done. I took the prepared divorce papers and went to see Carlos. He was in the mental hospital, looking like a completely different person. His eyes were dull, and he showed no interest in anything. The nurse said that besides saying Amelia, he hadn't said anything else. I told the nurse that I was Amelia. I asked her to take me to see Carlos. When Carlos saw me, there was finally a slight change on his dull face. He first smiled, then cried. Then he tentatively approached me and said, "I'm sorry." I wiped the tears from his face and softly said, "Carlos, do you love me?" This time he didn't hesitate and nodded affirmatively. I also smiled with satisfaction and said, "But Carlos has become like this, and you will drag Amelia down." "Do you want to drag Amelia down?" He seemed at a loss, not knowing how to react. After a while, he painfully shook his head. Then sign here, so you won't drag Amelia down anymore. Carlos picked up the pen with difficulty, and his usually neat handwriting was now crooked and messy. But fortunately, he finished signing. In the end, Carlos seemed to have a moment of clarity. As I was leaving, he grabbed the corner of my clothes, his voice choking. "Amelia, will you come back to see me?" I forcefully shook off Carlos and gently said, "Depends on the time, I'm very busy." When I walked out of the mental hospital, snowflakes were already falling from the sky. I reached out, trying to catch them. But the moment I touched them, the snowflakes instantly disappeared. I wrapped my coat tighter around me and walked forward. I thought no matter what the future holds, I would never look back again.